Let's take a look at hazards. And these hazards that we are going to talk about could pose a risk to your product, whether your product is food or drink or whether you're manufacturing packaging. And of course, this is a threat potentially to product at any stage in your process, from intake all the way through to dispatch or during storage. And so we really need to take care that these hazards cannot contaminate our product. And so it all starts with HACCP, of course, HACCP being a risk assessment tool where we look at hazards and how we can put control measures in place to mitigate the risk of these hazards contaminating our product. We talk about HACCP in more detail in a different talk. But let's take a look at these four categories. So there are microbiological hazards or biological, physical hazards, chemical or allergenic. For the microbiological, in the food industry, it is usually microbiological, but of course it could also be biological in terms of parasites and things that can be seen with the naked eye rather than a microscope. So we just bear that in mind, of course. And we also know that there are other hazards. There's a hazard of malicious contamination or fraud, which is something else that's considered in HACCP. But we're going to just focus on these four in particular for this talk. And so microbes, here you see moldy strawberries on the right hand side, and typically that's spoilage, isn't it, where we can visibly see, here we go, we can visibly see the spoilage here. But with spoilage, harm is unlikely. I mean, you're not likely to eat those moldy strawberries, but if you did, you'd probably be okay. And whereas pathogens are harmful, that's the very definition of a pathogen. It's a microbe that makes people sick. And the problem with pathogens is that they are not visible. So obviously we've got to prevent contamination. It's absolutely essential, or people will be harmed. And of course you can detect these through lab testing. So let's take a closer look at different kinds of microbes. We've got bacteria, and on the whole, bacteria is the biggest or most common microbiological contamination concern. But of course there's yeasts. Yeasts don't typically cause harm. We can use yeasts constructively through fermentation, for example, and as yeast to raise bread, for example. And molds, of course, and viruses. We can also use some bacteria beneficially, if you think of lactic acid bacteria to make yogurts and things like that, and molds to make blue cheese. So we can use microbes constructively, and there are many microbes that don't cause harm at all, but it's the pathogens that we worry about, isn't it? It's the pathogens that can cause harm, and of course, viruses can cause harm, certain bacteria can cause harm, certain molds can definitely cause harm. And yeah, so it's the pathogens that we are concerned about. On the whole, we prevent contamination throughout our manufacturing and storage processes. And so let's also just be aware that there are also spores that we need to be concerned about. So some bacteria can produce spores as a very resistant survival mechanism, and of course some molds produce spores also in order to spread. And we also need to be concerned about toxins. So some bacteria can produce toxins either while they are multiplying in the food, or once we've ingested them, then they can produce toxins inside our bodies. And some molds can produce mycotoxins, which are also very, very harmful. In terms of physical hazards, so these are physical contaminants. We are talking about things like glass, nails, bolts, string, jewelry, anything that's physical that can be contaminating our product. And of course, the best means of preventing this contamination is through the controls that we have in place. For example, the rules about wearing jewelry and wearing your PPE to cover your hair and your clothes, and the rules about best practice during maintenance procedures, etc. So prevention is absolutely the best means of preventing contamination. But we can also use detection devices. These are things like metal detectors, magnets, sieves, optical sorters, things like that. For chemicals, we are concerned about pesticides, heavy metals like lead, for example, and cleaning chemicals, and that's why we've got our rules about cleaning chemicals and locking them up. And also radiation is another example where radiological hazards need to be considered in a risk assessment by all sites manufacturing food products. Allergens is the next category of hazards that we're going to consider. This is incredibly serious and becoming more and more of a problem as more people become seriously allergic to certain foods. And this is where the body, there's an immune reaction, and it's a pretty quick immune response that happens, and it can cause death. So it can obviously cause mild symptoms, but all the way through to very severe symptoms. And so our products must not get contaminated with allergens. If it's not there as an ingredient, then it must not be there by accident. And so accurate labeling is what the consumer relies on. If somebody knows that they are allergic, then they are particularly going to take care to read the product labels to make sure that that product is all right for them to consume. Can you see how if they are buying a product in the shops, they've got nobody to ask? It's not, we're not talking about when they go and buy takeaway, for example, and they can ask about allergens in their burger, for example. No, we're talking about products that they buy in the shop. There's nobody to ask. They absolutely are relying on that label. So correct labeling, using the correct packaging, and that packaging being absolutely accurate in terms of the allergenic information or the ingredients information in there. It's absolutely essential that that is right. And if we take a look at this, these are the 14 official allergens in the UK, and this is what we need to know. We can't be confused about this. If you need to have a list up there, ask for a list in your factory to be published and put on the wall somewhere so that you're absolutely clear on what allergens are. If you're using allergens, they must be appropriately and clearly labeled. Use your dedicated PPE when handling the allergens, or whatever the rules are in your facility. Your HACCP team will have put those rules in place because they know whether you're handling allergens or not, and what's appropriate for you in terms of the rules on how to handle those allergens correctly to avoid contamination of other products that don't contain those allergens. So it's absolutely essential that you know those rules and you know what are official allergens. And when I say official allergens, that's because you will know, I know people, you'll know people who are allergic to other things not on this list, and they are perfectly valid as allergens. However, if they're not on this official list, it means that statistically speaking, there aren't enough cases to warrant getting on this list. And so in the UK, these are the big ones. These are the official allergens, and that's what we need to observe in a food factory or a related industry. And so in terms of the controls that we have in place, it's our procedures. We must absolutely observe our procedures. Your HACCP team will have put them in place based on the risks in your facility and the risks to your products in particular. And so we rely on our training also. If you're unsure, ask for refresher training, and so that you absolutely are aware of the controls in your business in order to produce safe product. So I hope that's really been useful to refresh you on those hazards. Of course, you can visit our website for more information or for more specific training regarding these topics.